A Tribute Pod production.
Feeling good? Here we go.
Open secret.
Hello and welcome to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. I'm Jane Van Tienen. Today's episode is a conversation about intelligence, but more than that, it's a conversation about difference, about what it means to think differently, work differently, lead differently, and how we can better recognise, support and benefit from diversity in our teams and our tradecraft. We're talking about inclusion in all its forms, from gender and communication styles to neurodivergence and the unwritten rules about what professionalism or leadership potential are supposed to look like. And yes, we're going to be challenging some of those. I'm joined today by a special guest co-host, Kat, my colleague from the UK. Kat brings with her years of OSINT experience and a personal connection to this topic. And we're in great company with two of the most respected names in the OSINT space, Micah Hoffman and Ginger T. Micah, many of you might know him as Web Breacher, is the co-owner and expert of OSINT at My OSINT Training, as well as the Deputy Chief of Investigations for the National Child Protection Taskforce. And Tony, better known online as Ginger T, is the founder of CQ Core Solutions and the creator of the OSINT Toolbox. Between them, Micah and Tony bring decades of experience in open source investigations, training and community leadership, as well as a generosity, humour and willingness to get into those grey areas that often go unspoken. Together we're going to cover everything from hyperfocus to hidden biases, career-limiting norms, AI and what it means to be an inclusive OSINT workplace if we designed it with difference in mind. This is a thoughtful conversation. It's honest and it's full of heart. Let's get into it. Today I'm joined by special guest co-host Kat Caudrelier, who's stepping in and shaking things up in the co-host seat for Kylie. Welcome, Kat. I've got an inkling that today's conversation is going to be right up your alley. So why don't you share with us what's sparking your interest in this topic of inclusion and open source intelligence?
Oh, thanks, Jane. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me along. It's great to be here. And yep, you're absolutely right. Neurodiversity is a big part of my life, both in personal and professional terms. I've worked in open source intelligence for many years, so to sit with yourself and our two lovely guests here and really get our teeth stuck into such a hot topic is fantastic.
Yeah, I reckon today's going to be a great conversation. But perhaps I should say, just for our listeners before we dive in, that I really want to be clear here that neither Kat nor I nor our guests today are experts by any stretch in terms of diversity and inclusion. I mean, sure, we've all got professional experiences and personal insights that we will bring to the conversation today, but our conversation really is in the service of making OSINT an accessible and inclusive career choice. So with that in mind, let me welcome our two guests. We have Micah Hoffman and Tony, also known as Ginger T. It's terrific to have you both. Thank you for coming on the pod today.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It strikes me that this episode is really an intersection of brains and bias and the breadcrumbs that we find on the internet, which of course is oftentimes a way that a lot of people refer to OSINT. But I suspect our conversation may in fact make some people feel uncomfortable. Maybe it's going to challenge how we think about intelligence, inclusion and OSINT. I know that both of you have worked in spaces where inclusion perhaps hasn't always been the priority, whether we're talking about gender or neurodiversity or additional needs or just different ways of showing up to work. So Micah, if I can turn to you first, what does inclusion mean to you in the world of OSINT?
I think it actually is one of the strongest things that you can bring into the OSINT equation. I've done many assessments, cybersecurity assessments, OSINT assessments, investigations, and I can tell you this, that although I might have the best tools or I might have access to some really great data sets, having another person that has a different way of looking at things, a different method of analyzing data, and somebody that can double check me makes my end product so much better.
And how about you, Tony? You remember a moment when you realized inclusion or maybe the lack of it was shaping the way intelligence or investigative work was being done?
Yes, certainly. For me, throughout my investigation OSINT career, I've seen a massive shift to what it used to be like maybe 20 years ago. And I've seen where inclusion has brought into the world of investigations and OSINT, a bit like what Micah said, different people with different ideas, and it opens your mind up to the other possibilities of what's out there, which maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, certainly wasn't what I was experiencing. But now for the employee that I work for, they're very good when it comes to inclusion.
I think we have come a long way in some respects, far from really being like a political commentary, I guess, about equity and diversity. I think inclusion really is understood, as both of you have said, to have real consequences for intelligence outcomes, and those consequences are good ones. And in fact, I've even seen commentators say that it's a strategic imperative when we're talking about national security, actually. But across all sectors, whether we're talking public or private sector, it just seems like inclusion makes good sense. Like it's all about better performance and decision making. So if it is good sense, even common sense, why is it that we still need to be having this conversation today?
I think the reason we're still talking about it within the Western world, or certainly within the UK, we're very fortunate. As I said before, the employee that I work for is very up on DI and inclusion, etc. But not all experiences are the same. Even though my experience has been positive, that's not necessarily the same for other people in the neurodivergent space. So I think that's why we're still talking about it. And I think we'll probably still be talking about it in 10 years' time in some parts of industry and in some countries.
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons, just adding to what Ginger was saying. I mean, it can absolutely be a cultural thing where some people are not appreciated as much in certain cultures, whether it be women or people of different gender identities or races. But also, I think some of it may also boil down to experience. I've got a lot of experience dealing with a wide variety of people all around the world that have different ideas. They bring different ways of analyzing problems. They bring their cultures into the investigation, so to speak. It's different than mine and it allows them to mesh with me to come up with some better solutions. But I know that there's a lot of people that work in places that hire people like them and that think like them because maybe they're serving a certain customer and that customer values people of a certain gender identity. So I agree with Tony 100% that I don't think we're ever going to be getting rid of the conversation of, hey, is it important to have diversity in your work? I think what we are going to see is people and companies that do embrace diversity of thought, diversity of people. They're going to be the ones that are going to be succeeding or going farther or going faster than the other one.
Yeah, when I think about success in the OSINT field, I sort of turn to something that I know that you've written about, Tony, and that is the investigative mindset that we talk about in OSINT. And so my question is, do you mind just explaining for our listeners what the investigative mindset is and how different brains or different ways of thinking might help or hinder this investigative mindset?
It's interesting. Before I found out I was dyslexic, I didn't actually understand how my brain was working in relation to investigations, even though I knew I enjoyed investigations. And from my personal opinion, and again, as you said, Jim, we're not experts. And even though I'm dyslexic, I'm not an expert. All dyslexic people will think differently. But for me, personally, it's about seeing the links, thinking outside the box, visualizing an investigation. And from an OSINT perspective, as I'm going along, I'm constantly seeing links. I'm constantly visualizing. I know, Micah, back in the day when you were on OSINT Curious, you did like the mind map. I'm able to do that as I go along. So half an hour down my OSINT investigation, I'm constantly visualizing so I can actually link back to things I've seen earlier and see a connection. Prior to finding out I was dyslexic, I didn't actually understand that's what I was doing. And it was quite an epiphany for me to be able to understand why I like investigations. And I kind of also touched a little bit on ADHD, where sometimes I can become super focused in on a task and I just absolutely go at it 100%. I'm just committed and tenacious when it comes to that task. The other flip side is I can be completely lazy as well and not do anything. And I think me and Kat have briefly spoke about advantages and disadvantages. Once you know that you're neurodivergent, then you can understand your advantages and disadvantages. Whereas before, I didn't actually understand what was going on. Now I do, and it's probably made me more confident. So we mentioned about inclusion. It's about getting the best out of a person, whether or not they're neurodivergent or not. Obtaining the best out of a person, I think, is ultimately the goal. But yeah, that's kind of where I come from an investigative perspective from being dyslexic.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you're a woman or from a different ethnicity, or you have some kind of visible sign that you might be different from the norm in a particular workplace, you can kind of perhaps more easily navigate or anticipate where you might encounter challenges. But perhaps when you have something that is hidden from view, and in some cases you might not even know that you have a different way of thinking to other people, like you were sort of talking about, Tony, those kind of hidden areas of diversity, hidden ways of thinking can be a real challenge in the workplace if you're not really sure what even barriers are existing for you out there.
I completely agree as well. It's that light bulb moment to think that you've spent so many years thinking that everybody thinks the same way, and you're like, oh no, I do think differently. And that actually really helps in some ways and it doesn't in others. It's this concept of neurodiversity which emphasizes that there's no single right way of thinking. There's no single methodology to it of thinking, of learning, of behaving. Everyone is different. So given that many of us have worked alongside both neurodivergent and neurotypical colleagues for possibly many years now, each bringing different ways of thinking and working, why does naming and understanding it still actually matter? What are we missing if we don't talk about it directly?
I think you're missing the compassion, right? Like Jane was just saying, if I can see somebody walks in on crutches or in a wheelchair, I can see that they're going to maybe need accommodation. They're going to need some grace. And I know this is a sad thing to say. If I don't know somebody is neurodiverse, I haven't worked with them in the past, and they analyze the situation differently, or they're acting maybe a little bit hyper-focused, like Tony was saying, not moving on to tackle other things, having that understanding of, hey, this person is working through their process, is doing their best on this, and I need to maybe give them a little bit more of a break. It helps me as a team player to understand that. Also, there are some things that are really hard in open source intelligence, and having somebody that's meticulous, that's tenacious, that can just, like Tony was saying, just focus in on something for a long time. That's an incredible ability to know about and to know that your colleagues have.
It's almost like pulling on the levers, the different levers that you need in order to get a great outcome. What do we need to do to challenge these norms, especially when it comes to who gets access to professional opportunity or visibility or advancement?
I think being a more senior person, an older person, whatever, it's one of my jobs to recognize that people need the opportunity to participate in the manner in which they're comfortable. For instance, during COVID, we saw that most everything went virtual, and that remains for a lot of conference presentations. And there are other ways of contributing to the field, to an event, that if we get creative and if we really want that person to participate, as long as they're willing, we can offer them a variety of things to choose from if they want to participate. And if they still don't, that's absolutely fine. That doesn't diminish what they've done in the field.
Yeah, I completely agree. And in fact, I'm excited by the opportunities when I think about the global OSINT community. That I think that there are a lot of different ways and different modalities that people can contribute to the community that are outside the realm of the norm when you think about professional conferences and in-person networking. And what about you, Tony? Do you think that we can build better systems together to include people in opportunities when we don't necessarily understand what's holding them back?
Yeah, 100%. I kind of look at recruitment and the recruiting process. Is the recruiting process a process that wants the best candidate or the person who performs best in the interview process or the recruitment process? Because I sometimes feel that you will get people in the recruitment process who just ace it. But actually, when it comes to doing the work, they're not so good at the work, but they're really good at the recruitment process. Whereas you get other people who may be neurodivergent, cannot demonstrate their true ability in that recruitment process. But if you gave them the job, they'd probably be better at the job. For me, it's about not doing a thing just one way. Look at different ways of doing it to get the best out of all your candidates, whether they're neurodivergent or atypical. When people are advertising for jobs, I think it is important to ask if people are neurodivergent. And if you're open and honest about it, then there's no reason why you shouldn't get help.
Completely agree. A lot of organisations seem to think that there's a lot of resource that needs to be put into helping neurodiverse people through these sorts of things. And support might just be literally putting fidget spinners into the interview room. It might be just that giving them extra time. It doesn't cost anything. It's not an expensive resource. So there's just maybe a little lack of imagination sometimes. So thinking about those kind of processes and organizational level, sort of maybe from higher up, is there a piece of professional advice you've received in your career that, looking back through a neurodiversity lens, you think we should no longer have to hear or just retire?
Can I flip that and say something that I would like to hear? So a previous boss of mine, he said to our team, before you judge anybody's actions, whether it's an email or something they've done somewhere else or something that you perceive as a slight, always think of them as coming from good intentions. Their behaviors are coming from good intentions. And then be curious. Ask them those kind questions. I can tell you, looking back in my career, before I understood about neurodiversity, before I understood that, hey, having different types of people working together was really a strength, I was frustrated when people weren't turning in things on time or in the proper format. And looking back, I kick myself for mandating specific formats and precision in that format when I really should have been looking at the overall picture of, hey, is the content coming in? Am I asking for things in the right way? Am I giving them enough time for them to complete the tasks?
I think I've heard you say grace, compassion, curiosity. All of these are on a checklist for life, really, aren't they? So, Tony, back to you. Something that I've been chewing in my mind is that neurodiversity is pretty frequently referred to as a superpower. And you've mentioned yourself, your capacity to be hyper-focused on particular issues, and that has been really great on occasion for investigations and what have you. But in your view, is that a helpful way to reframe difference? And are we just kind of glossing over something that really is a challenge or a barrier for people in the workplace? What's your view on that?
It's interesting. So you will hear people who are neurodivergent saying that they don't like the word superpower. And I kind of think to myself, well, it's up to the individual person. If they feel they've got a superpower, they've got a superpower. I ain't got no issues with it. If you, as somebody who's neurodivergent, doesn't like it, I'm fine. So since I found out I was dyslexic, I'm far more confident about the way I think, about the way I investigate things. Whereas previously, people have challenged me and I've actually thought I was wrong. Micah's mentioned this in previous years gone by, having imposter syndrome. And that's how I used to feel. I'm not saying I've got a superpower per se, but I am far more confident in what I am saying. And I'm probably far more willing to stand my ground and challenge, whereas previously I wasn't. Now, everybody who's neurodivergent has something different to offer that other people don't have. And I think we've all touched on it. That needs to be embraced and that needs to be used. And if a supervisor or an organisation or an employer can see that, then they can harness different way of thinking. And when I was down in Australia last year, it was on LinkedIn that I saw dyslexic thinking is recognised on LinkedIn as a skill. Not a superpower, but it's recognised as a skill. So therefore, maybe see these as an extra skill.
Do you think it's more a way of then not going to those extremes? And actually, we're all different. We're just going back to where we started with this. We're all different, neurotypicals, neurodiverse people, and we all just have different skills. It's literally as simple as that.
Yeah, 100%. Micah said before, and I think you mentioned it, Jane, but having a team of people and understanding the strengths. I don't really like to use weaknesses, but understanding the strengths that people have and embracing that and getting the best out of those people. Because at the end of the day, nobody's 100% good at everything.
I love thinking about neurodiversity and some of the personality traits that come from it, like hyper focus and probably attention to detail too, because you want to double and triple check your work because you're aware of that there could be errors there. That stuff are those skills. And when I'm working in a team, we will compile a team of people that are great with languages or people that are great with other types of things like geolocation or something. And having somebody that has those mental powers, not superpowers, but those mental skills, those are valued or should be valued on a team. So I love thinking about it that way.
Gus Kangas was guest on a previous Open Secrets episode, and he likened, which I thought was great, he likened the Marvel Avengers to an intel team and how we all have our own strengths and we have that time in the spotlight, but we're really a force to be reckoned with when we all come together and we all use those skills together, and it can only make us stronger. I see that as a really good analogy.
My father was a master electrician, and I loved all of the tools that he carried on his tool pouch. And I can remember that, thinking that this man, when he would go into somebody's house, he had all of the tools that he needed. I didn't have half of the tools or even a quarter of the tools that he had. And as such, I had to keep borrowing tools. And I found that was the way that I could recognize his seniority, his greatness. And bringing that to every single team that I've been on. If I think of everybody's OSINT skills, social skills, communication skills, analytical skills as just tools in a toolbox or tools in a tool belt, then I can look at Tony and go, he's got this, this, and this, but he might not have that, and that. And Kat, you've got those things. So, when we assemble, like you said, when the Marvel team or put all our tools on the table, we can really solve some great problems.
Thinking back to when I first started in Intel and the training that we were given, generally seems to be very structured, sort of linear thinking type training, thinking of things like analytical techniques, analysis of competing hypotheses, even going to sort of the intelligence cycle. And I remember being taught that and how it's just one way. And no, you jump backwards and you can go side to side and you don't even have to stick in the cycle. You can move outside it. Ta-da! So how can OSINT training and methodologies better account for non-linear, creative problem-solving approaches, which are often associated with neurodivergent minds?
Within neurodivergence, there's cognitive differences. There's also cognitive diversity as well. And that lends itself quite well to intelligence work, because to get the best, you need to see outside of that linear training, and you need to embrace innovation. You need to embrace new ideas, because otherwise you're just going to miss things because you're just sticking to one way of doing things. And again, I think we've all said it tonight about the OSINT community. No one person knows everything there is to know about OSINT, unless Micah's going to tell me he does. But I look at the OSINT community and there's people who are absolutely ace at geolocation. I'm okay at it, but if I really wanted, I'd have to go to an expert. I think you've got to look outside the box, and I think you've got to embrace new ideas, new ways of doing things. Otherwise, you are going to miss things. And I think critical thinking in the intelligence world is something that plays a big part. So I think, Kat, it is that ability to see beyond what is in front of you and go, right, well, what about this? What about that? And I think that's where your cognitive diversity comes in as well.
So I was a product of this is the way you think, this is the right answer, and this is how you get to it, that linear path. And it drove me nuts because I'm a very creative person. And I always thought to myself, if I can get to that a different way that still gets to the right answer, it still should be right. So fast forward to today, I'm seeing and built many times those types of systems where we can ask a question about, hey, can you find this bit of information? And it doesn't matter which tool you use or which technique you use to get there. As long as you get to the right answer, then, or that right piece of data that we're looking for, fine. And the way that we try to reinforce that and train that in courses that I make, in the podcast that I talk on, is that we teach methodology a lot more. Instead of you use this tool, you get the output, there's the answer, and you're done. We think about how we're thinking about things. And when we do that, we also engage with our students a lot more, asking them the questions. I grew up in a lecture-only environment that was just mind-numbing, and I hated it. And you've probably been to those places too. And you're like, okay, this person clearly knows a lot, but they're just not reaching me. So what we try to do is increasingly ask questions. There is no one way to do open source intelligence correctly.
When it comes to neurodivergence, Tony, you mentioned earlier about, the question and answer format just doesn't work for you. My question is more around social interaction. So working in OSINT can mean that sometimes there's a need to understand social cues, not only when looking into online information, reading subreddits, looking at public Telegram channels, actually deciphering the context and maybe the hidden meaning behind certain things, but also when just speaking normally to colleagues. Is this something that might put neurodivergent people off working in the industry, or actually is it something that's bringing them in because it's maybe easier to understand the online world and the social cues on there?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Since the advent of the internet and technology, we've seen neurodivergence accepted more. That's allowed people who are neurodivergent to come forward to excel. And sometimes it is from a social interaction. I think it is easy for some people, not just neurodivergent people, for all people to sit behind a screen and feel safe. At the end of the day, you have your social space, don't you? And that social space is going to be different depending on who you are. Some people are quite happy face to face. Some people need a massive gap. But when you're online, I think you do feel more comfortable. You're at home, maybe. You're in your own surroundings. And I think within the OSINT community is a quite open, friendly community I've found over the years I've been in it, far more so than other communities online. So I think OSINT, and I would say anybody who, and I can only really talk from being dyslexic is anybody who's dyslexic should look at OSINT, should look at investigations, should look at intelligence and say, well, actually, my brain is probably suited to that type of work.
And from my perspective, I harken back to the talk about having those skills, right? If one of your strengths is being able to understand videos and body language and facial expressions, all of those subtle micro expressions and all, then you've got higher marks for that, whether you're neurodivergent or not.
I love the fact that we're always coming back to everybody is different, no matter who you are, what you've got, anything like that. So my next question, let's see how we go with it. The OSINT field can be, as we know, really cognitively overwhelming from the types of things you're seeing, which can be triggering, from the vast amount of information you have to go through to get that needle in a haystack. And obviously some things that are triggering for some people aren't triggering for others. How do neurodivergent OSINT practitioners navigate that? And is it any different what neurotypical people would do, or are there specific strategies that might help?
The vast amounts of information, I'm able to visualize, I'm able to see links, I'm able to park things, and then later on when I see something, I can link it together. I'm not very good at maths, but I kind of look at it as paint by numbers. As I go along, I'm just painting by numbers, I'm building the picture as I go along, and I kind of see it like that. I think it's also important to understand context about what you're seeing as well, because context means a lot. And somebody who's neurotypical might not see the same context I see. They might not see the same links that I see.
Micah, have you observed any breakthroughs where different kinds of thinking might have just unlocked an investigation or some work that you're doing?
It's different types of thinking, but it's also, I have several colleagues that have that tunnel vision in a positive way, that intense focus and determination that they know that they can find something that will connect person A and person B. They just have to find it. And I think it's really to their credit. They have this insane belief that it will be there, that positive thinking. And then they don't seek to prove it. They just follow the data and can map it out. And after opening 7,000 tabs in their Firefox browser, they find that connection. They're like, I knew it. And it might have been 8 hours or 10 hours later, but they sure enough have found it. And I have a colleague who's done that many, many times. And I'm like, I would have given up long before I even got halfway through what he did. But it's that tenacity. So again, going back to skills inventory, going back to like what Tony was saying, knowing yourself, being able to say, I am neurotypical or I'm neurodiverse and I'm hyper-focused and I have an insane attention to detail. Those are kind of the positive skills that come from your different ability.
I love this concept of skills inventory. And Tony, you sort of saying that, hey, even on LinkedIn, you saw a reflection on that, which is actually really cool.
Yeah, so if we move on to thinking about OSINT teams, how they're configured in the workplace itself, Micah, if I come to you for this one, you've written about accessibility in open source intelligence. So what barriers do you think still exist for neurodivergent professionals, and what practical steps can the industry take to make OSINT just more inclusive?
I will go back to what Jane said in the beginning, that I am not an expert on this at all. I'm just a guy with some lived experience. And my opinion is that since each person processes data in different ways, each person can ingest that data in different ways, that we all need to, one, provide teams where people feel comfortable saying, hey, I have a color blindness, or hey, I can't deal with things with such small font or whatever, and think about how we actually are presenting data to the people on our team. This is a really tough thing too, because we can't support those people and treat them in a way that, and so that they can best utilize their skills in a positive way without understanding that they have different skills and different ways of processing things. So going back to what Tony was saying, to some degree, we need to know that somebody processes data differently, that somebody is dyslexic or colorblind, because then we can accommodate that.
People are still faced with certain opinions and certain judgments within workplaces. And especially from my experience and what I've seen with different genders as well, they seem to face different barriers too, especially with regards to neurodiverse behaviors. For instance, women were often labeled troublesome if they were straight talking or quite blunt in maybe their responses to certain questions. But in the same scenario, a man would maybe be labeled assertive. And the same, it goes the other way. If a man who empathizes more would then be called emotional or something worse, which I won't say in this podcast, but then it wouldn't be picked up on with it being a woman sometimes. That's kind of my experience. Have you come across that as well in the workplaces that you've worked in?
I absolutely have. It comes down to your own way of how you process different people's information. I think that a lot of people need to take that look at themselves, because labeling things as, hey, this person is this way, but this person is that way, it comes down to your perception. And like I said earlier, if I can think, hey, everybody's got good intentions here. We all want the best product or the best outcome for this. We're all working together. Let's think about how we're presenting the information and how we're receiving the information. If we can think about that, and I can think about how I'm receiving that information, I can maybe change my mind.
So if we think about what kinds of things we need to put together to create the ideal neuro-inclusive OSINT workplace, I've heard in our conversation today that we would want curiosity, we'd want compassion, we'd want acceptance, we'd want the ability to be humble and to admit where we're at fault and where we have room to learn. What are we missing when we think about what the ideal neuro-inclusive workplace should look like? Is there anything that either of you would add?
For people who are neurotypical, is to see that your team is different. And I can tell you now, a lot of neurodivergent people are completely different to what I am. And even as a neurodivergent person, I struggle sometimes to understand how other neurodivergent people are. So even someone who's neurodivergent, I can struggle as well. So I know it's a difficult task. You've got to give people time. You've got to have that compassion. You've got to have that acceptance. And you've got to have the reasonable adjustments that people need as well, and to give them the tools that they need.
Yeah, I think I would add openness to that too. The workplace or the group dynamics need to be one where people feel like they can share. Hey, I have dyslexia. Hey, I have ADHD, and I need this type of extra time on my project, or I need you to give me things in a written format before you just spring it to me in a meeting. Just so that we can best harness each other's skills. And I think that we should shift our thinking to see those positive traits that arise and see them as strengths instead of accommodations that need to be made.
I think, Mike, you mentioned perception, and I think neurodivergency and mental health. If you see somebody with a broken leg and a cast, it's visual. You can see they've got a broken leg. There's no stigma to somebody having a broken leg. It's accepted. However, neurodivergency, mental health, there's still stigma attached to those. They're not visual to people. They don't necessarily understand, because there's an old saying in this, shouldn't judge a book by its cover. I think we still do. I think we still judge people by the cover. And for neurodivergent people, and the same people, people who've got mental health issues as well, they need to feel confident that they can come forward, that they can discuss, that there are no stigmas attached to it, that they'll be treated just like somebody who's got a broken leg. It's compassion.
One of the first conversations that I have with people who are reporting to me as a manager is always, hey, what's your preference here in terms of how we communicate? And it's not a question about whether someone has ADHD or autism. It's just about a preference and about, hey, how is it that we can work best together to achieve the best outcome? Because that's what I care about.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to understanding the human condition, understanding who you're working with and how to best work with them.
A lot of times when I think about mentoring and leadership, it's that old saying that I hear often, you can't be what you can't see. And of course, in terms of cognitive diversity, you can't see that, but you can if people actually call it out.
That's something that's really struck me about today's podcast is the vocabulary that's been used. And it's not vocabulary that I hear very often around neurodivergence. And, like Jane, you mentioned it earlier, Micah, Tony, you've all mentioned compassion, kindness, caring, being approachable, and quite refreshing to hear those terms when you don't hear them often.
I think that diversity of thought, diversity of experience and background is nothing more than a strength to any team. And I can't tell you the number of times that it saved my butt in that I didn't understand something in a different culture or in a different language, that nuance, but somebody else who had that lived experience, came from that culture or just was of that generation, helped explain it to me and correct my product and make something better for our teams.
The people I work for, because they are very good at DEI and neurodiversity, that's actually helped me to come here today, because I've got confidence in them as leaders. So therefore, that's enabled me to have confidence in myself to come here today to hopefully encourage or inspire others to go forward and embrace neurodiversity, or find out whether or not they are neurodiverse, and to live a fuller, better life.
We really appreciate the conversation today.
You've been listening to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. Open Secret was created by Kylie Pert, Amanda Shane, and Jane Van Tienen. A podcast by OSINT Combine. Make sure to visit our website, osintcombine.com, for information on how OSINT Combine can help you find, analyse, and act using open source information. Open Secret is recorded on the lands of the Cubby Cubby people. OSINT Combine acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the land where we work, live, and learn.
A Tribute Pod production.